the takeaway from all the discussion that we had is so the takeaway is that for a country like USA, or for that matter any country, these corner points are points of specialization. If the country chooses to produce at those corner points on the PPF, that means it is specializing just in the production of one commodity, in this case large jets, there it would be corn. If it is producing anywhere else on this PPF, it is producing at these points, then it is basically exhausting its resources into producing the combination of the two goods. So, at all these points it is producing a certain combination of large jets and corn, and in the process it is exhausting all its available resources. If it produces at an interior point like these, then the country is producing a combination of the two goods, but in producing those combinations it is not exhausting its resources, and so it can produce more of both. And if there is a point like that, then the country is neither able to produce that point, and hence the question of efficiency does not arise, because given the current resources of the country, that point is not even attainable, right? So that was our takeaway from the previous discussion. Now let's take it a step forward. Now we said that this was kind of the discussion for today was basically coming from the principle of opportunity cost, and you saw how the principle of opportunity cost is kind of embedded in that discussion. But why are we even discussing this opportunity cost? In the real world, where does this play in, or what is the significance of this concept of opportunity cost? So, in the real world, the concept of opportunity cost is what guides international trade. The trade between nations in goods and services is actually governed by this principle of opportunity cost. So, to understand international trade, it is important to understand this concept of opportunity cost and how it kind of guides international trade. So, let us first understand two concepts that are based on opportunity cost. These two concepts are absolute advantage and comparative advantage. We will call this AA, absolute advantage. And comparative advantage, or CA. So, what is absolute advantage? Whenever a country can produce more absolute amount of a good, it is said to have absolute advantage. For example, if you consider United States and Bangladesh, let's say United States can produce more large jets than Bangladesh, then it is said that United States would have absolute advantage over Bangladesh in large jets. If Bangladesh can produce more corn than United States, then Bangladesh has more absolute advantage in corn compared to United States. So, if you produce more of something, that just gives you absolute advantage. So, you can understand that a country that has more resources is likely to be able to produce more of a commodity, and hence it will have absolute advantage in the commodity. So, you kind of get a sense that all big countries, all rich countries, all developed countries which have more amount of resources are likely to produce more of all goods, and hence they would have absolute advantage in all goods. And if you are able to produce more of something, then there is no need for you to take that good from someone else. There is no need for you to go into exchange of goods and services with other countries. So, this kind of tells you the concept of absolute advantage kind of makes the concept of international trade redundant. It tells you that if I am rich, if I am developed, I have more resources, then I will be able to produce more of everything, and I don't need to go into exchange with something, with some other country which produces less than me, or I don't need to go into exchange with another country that maybe produces at a lower cost than me, because I just have more of these commodities. So absolute advantage does not tell you anything about international trade. In fact, it contradicts the concept of international trade or exchange of goods and services between commodities. What really guides the principle of international trade is comparative advantage, because comparative advantage tells you which country is able to produce a good or a service at the lowest opportunity cost. So, who is able to produce a commodity by giving up less of the other commodity. So, that is comparative advantage. This just means you are producing more. There is no concept of cost. You produce 100 large jets and you are producing maximum amount in the world, then you have absolute advantage. But in the concept of comparative advantage is where you see the concept of cost coming in, and we are saying that it is someone who is not only producing more, but it is someone who is producing it with the lowest sacrifice. And that sacrifice could be in terms of money, it could be in terms of time, it could be in terms of another commodity. So, that is the concept of comparative advantage. Now, let us go a little bit deeper, let us try to understand this, but before that let us give a more simple example and make sure that you understand what is absolute advantage and comparative advantage. So, let us say I give you a test in the class and two students scored the maximum points, they both get a 99 out of 100. So, both of them basically have absolute advantage over everyone else because they have earned the maximum number of points, and hence they have absolute advantage. No other student has got 99, so these two have absolute advantage. But let us say one of them studied for 5 hours to get that 99 score, and another student just studied for 1 hour to get that 99 score. Then the student who has studied for 1 hour has comparative advantage over the student who studied for 5 hours, because this first student only sacrificed 1 hour of his time to get the score 99, whereas the second student had to sacrifice 5 hours of time to achieve this score 99. So, the first one has comparative advantage, the second one does not have comparative advantage, although both of them have absolute advantage. So, what is our takeaway from here? Our takeaway is that nations may have absolute advantage in a commodity, but that does not mean that they will also have comparative advantage. So, someone could have absolute advantage and yet not have comparative advantage, or have absolute advantage as well as comparative advantage, or may not have either absolute advantage or comparative advantage. So, both are possible. So, all three are possible. So, there could be a country that has both absolute advantage and comparative advantage, only comparative advantage and no absolute advantage, or it could be the other way round also. It could have absolute comparative advantage but not absolute advantage, that is also possible, or neither comparative advantage nor absolute advantage, that is also possible. So, all those different combinations are possible in the world, but please remember that just having this absolute advantage, does not say anything about whether the country should go into trade or which commodity the country should trade. It is comparative advantage that actually leads to the principle of international trade, what commodities must be traded and how much. Let us understand how this concept of comparative advantage actually governs international trade, and to understand that we go back to our model assumptions of the world having only two countries, and these two countries only produce two goods. So, let us say these countries are United States and Bolivia. We could have assumed any two countries, we could have taken any country X or Y, does not matter, but let us say we are assuming United States and Bolivia. If you think about these two countries, then United States is definitely a bigger country than Bolivia. It's a richer country than Bolivia. So it is most obvious that United States has more resources than Bolivia. So United States mostly has absolute advantage in all commodities or many commodities compared to Bolivia. However, that does not say anything about whether USA should have comparative advantage over Bolivia or not. Okay. So let's kind of understand whether USA has comparative advantage and how that would translate. So let's say this is USA. Producing largets and corn. So it doesn't matter, I could have taken corn on the x-axis and largets on the y-axis, it wouldn't make any difference. And there is Bolivia, which also produces largets and corn. So let's say if USA puts all its resources into making largets, then it can produce 40 largets. And if it puts all its resources into making corn, then it can produce 30 corn, right? So basically the coordinates of this point are 40, 0. Let's name that point A. And the coordinates of this point is 0, 30. Let's call that point B. And there is also another point C where USA produces a combination of largets and corn, let's say 20 and 15. So the coordinates of this point is 20, 15. Okay. And so let's say before trade, before any kind of exchange takes place between United States and Bolivia, USA just decides to produce at this point. So it is producing at point C. So it is producing 20 units of largets and it is producing 15 units of corn. And let's say this is Bolivia. So Bolivia produces, let's say, 10 units of largets. So the coordinates of this point is 10, 0. And it also produces 10 of corn. So the coordinates of this point is 0, 10. Let's name these points X and Y. So Bolivia is producing at a point like Z, where it is producing some combination of X and Y. So the coordinates of Z are 5 and 5. Those are the coordinates, right? So let's say without any kind of relationship between these two countries, this is the situation. So there is no relationship between these countries right now. If USA decided to put all its resources into largets, then it could make point A, that is only 40 largets and no corn. If USA decided to put all its resources into corn, then it would make 30 corn and no largets. But USA actually decides to produce point C. That means it decides to allocate its resources into making 20 units of largets and 15 units of corn, and in doing so it has exhausted all its resources. Okay. Now if you think about that, the same thing holds for Bolivia. Bolivia, if it puts all its resources into largets, it can make 10 largets. If it puts all its resources into corn, it can make only 10 corn, and it decides to produce at a point like Z, where it is making some combination of largets and corn. So it is making 5 largets and 5 corn. Now if you just look at this picture, then you can understand that United States has absolute advantage in corn as well as largets. I repeat, USA has absolute advantage in corn and largets because Bolivia can never match up the production of USA in terms of how many it can produce when it puts all its resources into making these goods. USA can produce a maximum of 40 large jets and a maximum of 30 corn, and even if Bolivia used all its resources into making either of those goods, it would only end up making 10 large jets or 10 corn. So USA clearly has absolute advantage in large jets, and it has absolute advantage in production of corn. So if we just focus on the concept of absolute advantage, then this picture basically leads you to believe that USA never has to trade in large jets or in corn with Bolivia, because USA can always produce more than Bolivia. Then why should it even go into exchange or trade with Bolivia? But now, like I told you, that absolute advantage is not what governs international trade, it is comparative advantage. So now that means we need to figure out what is the opportunity cost of producing large jets and what is the opportunity cost of producing corn for these two countries separately, right? So let's do that calculation. Let's say USA is at this point, point C, and it wants to go from point C to point A. Okay, it wants to go to that point. So if USA is going from point C to point A, then it is gaining 40 large jets, but it is having to give up 15 corn. So can we say that the opportunity cost of producing 20 additional large jets is 15 corn? Or the opportunity cost, and I am writing OC for opportunity cost, the opportunity cost of one large jet is 15 by 20 corn, okay, and we can simplify that to 3 by 4 corn. That means every time USA produces one extra large jet, it has to give up 3/4 units of corn. Similarly, for the other commodity, if I go in the other direction, instead of going from C to A, if I go in that direction, then I can say that whenever United States gains 15 corn, it goes from 0 to 15 corn, it has to give up 20 large jets. So I can say that the opportunity cost of 15 corn is 20 large jets, or the opportunity cost of one corn is 20 by 15 large jets, that is 4 by 3 large jets. So every time USA makes an additional corn, it has to give up 4/3 unit of large jet. Please note that these two are reciprocals of each other, and that is true because we are assuming that the PPF is a straight line. Had the PPF been a curve, then that wouldn't be true. Okay, since we assume that the relationship is linear, that's why we are getting that reciprocal result here. Anyways, let's do the same exercise for Bolivia and see what we get for Bolivia. So every time if we move from point Z to Y, going from Z to Y, and we could have taken any 2 points on the PPF, it wouldn't matter. You can check for B to C and C to B, you will get the same result. Now let's do Z to Y. As Bolivia is moving from Z to Y, please note that it is gaining 5 additional large jets, but to gain 5 additional large jets, it is having to give up 5 units of corn. So we can say the opportunity cost of 5 large jets is 5 corn, or opportunity cost of 1 large jet would be 5 divided by 5 corn, which is basically 1 corn. And if we went the opposite direction, if we went to Y to Z, then we would get the opportunity cost of 1 corn, which would be the reciprocal of that, like we saw last time. Instead of 3 by 4, it was 4 by 3. So reciprocal of 1 is still 1, so it would be 1 large jet, right? So this gives us the opportunity cost of producing 1 additional unit of a commodity. Please let's compare between the two countries. For United States, to produce 1 extra large jet, United States has to give up 3/4 of a corn. 3/4 you know is 0.75. And for Bolivia to produce that same one large jet, it has to give up 1 corn. So the sacrifice of USA is less than the sacrifice of Bolivia. Bolivia has to sacrifice 1 unit of corn, but USA only has to sacrifice 0.75 unit. And if you go back to the definition of comparative advantage, we said that a country has comparative advantage when it has lower opportunity cost. In other words, when it has lower sacrifice to produce something. That means this clearly tells us that USA is the one that has comparative advantage. USA has comparative advantage CA in large jets because it is only having to give up 3/4 of corn to produce a large jet, whereas Bolivia has to give up 1 full unit of corn. Let's compare for the other commodity now. To produce 1 extra unit of corn, USA has to give up 4/3 of a large jet, which is definitely greater than 1, because if you just convert this, then that comes to 1.33, right, recurring 1.33, whereas to produce 1 unit of corn, Bolivia only has to give up 1 large jet. So this is greater than 1, that is 1, right. So you can see that for Bolivia, there is a comparative advantage in producing corn because it has to make lesser sacrifice of large jets than United States. So we can say that Bolivia has comparative advantage in corn. So going back, please note that although USA had absolute advantage in both commodities, it only has comparative advantage in one of the commodities. And whereas Bolivia, where it had absolute advantage in neither commodities, it still has comparative advantage in one of the commodities. So now this kind of tells you, now if you go by comparative advantage, this tells you that USA is superior in making large jets, whereas Bolivia is superior in producing corn. So now if you go by comparative advantage, it does give you a rationale for exchange between the countries. If I am good at making something, then I should concentrate on doing something and leave the other stuff to someone else. Think about a group project. Whenever you are doing a group project, you are doing something that you are good at. Probably you are researching the material, someone else is making the PowerPoint slides, someone else is doing the oral presentation, and always we tend to divide that labor, we tend to divide that work based on what we are good at, what we have comparative advantage at. The same is true also at the level of these nations, also at the level of the country. It is always beneficial for a country not to go into production of everything and instead concentrate or specialize in the production of the commodity which they are good at or in which they have comparative advantage, right. So by that logic, United States should specialize in large jets because it has comparative advantage in producing large jets, and Bolivia by the same logic should specialize in the production of corn because it has comparative advantage in production of corn. So if that is true, it means that United States, after it decides to go into trade, after it decides to establish those trade relations, United States, instead of producing C, it should actually produce at point A, just make large jets, 40 large jets, right. And similarly, Bolivia should only concentrate in producing corn. So instead of producing at point Z, it should actually produce at point X when they decide to go into trade relations. So now United States has 40 large jets but 0 corn, and Bolivia has 10 large jets, 10 corn and 0 large jets. So how would USA suffice its need for corn? From where will USA get corn, and from where will Bolivia get its large jets? Because they still were making some before they went into trade. They were making both the commodities. So that is where trade plays in. Since USA is making 40 large jets, it always has the ability of giving some of these 40 large jets to Bolivia And since Bolivia is making 10 corn, it is always possible for Bolivia to give some corn to USA, right? And how many large jets would USA give to Bolivia? Now USA is producing 40 and before trade it was producing 20. So USA should be fine giving anything between 20 or less to Bolivia, right? Because it has additional 20. It was making 20, it was producing 20 before trade. After trade and after specialization, it is producing 40 large jets. So it is making 20 additional large jets. So it should be absolutely okay to give those extra 20 or anything less than 20 to Bolivia. It is not able to give more than 20 because it is not producing so many additional large jets. And as for Bolivia, please note that Bolivia, when it concentrates in producing corn, it makes 10 corn. But before trade, it was producing 5 corn. So that means it cannot give anything more than 5 to USA. Because before trade, it was producing 5 and it was consuming 5 on its own within its own country. So after specialization, it started making additional 5. So that additional is the amount that it can send to USA. So we can say that here USA would be willing to give 20 or less, and Bolivia would be willing to give 5 corn or less. So anything that is in addition to your own need, you can give to others, right? If you have $100 and you need $80, then you have only $20 to lend out to someone or give to a friend, correct? The same thing. Here before trade, USA was needing 20 and producing 20. After trade or after specialization, it is producing 40, so it can give the additional amount to Bolivia, right? Whereas Bolivia before trade, it was producing and using 5. After trade agreement, it is specializing and producing 10, so you can give the additional 5 to United States. Now you can say that why would United States go into a treaty with Bolivia? Because even when it produces just by itself, it was producing 15 corn. Then why should it be willing to go into trade with Bolivia and take 5 corn? The reason being that United States has comparative advantage in producing large jets. So it is easier and more profitable for United States to concentrate on large jets and send the additional large jets to other countries, to export those large jets to other countries, and the compromise would be to do with less corn. So it is making more money, or it is a profitable deal for United States to send large jets or export large jets to other countries, and in the process accept maybe little bit less corn than what it could produce earlier, because this is a suboptimal point than that because of the concept of comparative advantage. So we can see that trade is mutually beneficial to countries irrespective of the size or the wealth or the level of resources of a country. Trade is always going to be mutually beneficial to any country, and that is the reason that you see that these big countries go into trade with smaller countries. Otherwise, apparently, United States does not need to trade with any smaller country, but it still does. If you walk into Walmart, you see these goods which are made in Vietnam, made in Philippines, made in India, made in Bangladesh. It is going into trade because there is this concept of comparative advantage. Everyone is not good at everything. So United States just focuses on what it is good at, and for the other goods, it just gets it, goes into exchange with the other countries, and those countries probably have comparative advantage in those goods. For example, cotton shirts. Whenever you buy cotton shirt in USA, it is probably made in India, or it is made in Egypt, or it is made in Indonesia. So those countries probably have comparative advantage in cotton shirts, so they can send cotton shirts to USA. Whereas if you go to India or Vietnam or to Indonesia, you probably see, machineries, capital goods, for example, large equipments or medical devices, they are all made in USA because USA has comparative advantage in those goods, and it is profitable for USA to send it to those countries. So the bottom line, your takeaway from this discussion today is that trade is mutually beneficial for all countries irrespective of their size, and trade is governed by the concept of comparative advantage. And in the concept of a comparative advantage, you have embedded the concept of opportunity cost, because comparative advantage is the same thing as having low opportunity cost of doing something. So, we will end here today, and next time when we come, we are going to go over another principle, which is the principle of demand and supply, which kind of defines what a market is and how a market works in an economy.